Editing film scans, definitely one of my favorite parts of the creative process, and something that I've been meaning to make a video about for a while now. So today I want to share a few of my images and just talk a little bit about my process and share the way that I do things when I'm editing my images. And this is not meant to be a kind of how to edit video, just because I really do believe that there's no right or wrong way to do things when it comes to creative decisions for editing. I really do think that as artists, it's super important that we embrace the things that excite us the most and that we don't try and do things a certain way because we think that's how they should be done, or maybe because we think that that's what people are going to enjoy the most. So in saying that, I hope that this video today and this kind of behind the scenes look helps you in one way or another just by giving you a little bit of a look into the way that I do things and some of the decisions I've made and why I've made them. Also, just one more note, all of the editing that we're going to be looking at today is focused on scans from a lab. And the reason for that is because I find myself over the last 6 months really going the route of getting my images scanned at a lab, just because I like obviously the convenience and the speed of it, but then I also really like the colors that I get back for those images from a lab. I find that the scanning I do at home, although I get results I'm happy with, it often takes me a lot longer, and I'm also at times struggling to really kind of get my colors right. So my idea recently is get scans done at a lab, lower res ones that I could use for social media and printing, smaller prints, and then when I go to do larger prints in the future, or books or anything like that, I kind of have these baseline images to work off, and I can rescan those images here, and it gives me something to kind of match up to. So anyways, just wanted to mention that. Let's jump into things. So today I'm going to share two different sets of images. The first set of images is from an ongoing series that I've been working on that you've all probably seen out in the American Southwest. And then I'm also going to share a few images from a recent series I started working on. And if you watched my Pentax 645 video, you're going to recognize them. That's some of these images from this junkyard shot on the Pentax. And the reason I want to share these two series is because they're both very different in terms of the way they look, and that kind of ties into a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today. And for me, editing isn't just adjusting a bunch of sliders to get an image to a point where I'm happy with it, but it's really also building a consistent look across a body of work. And just making decisions that tie into a specific theme that I have kind of thought out from the start. And we'll kind of see that as we look at some of these images here today. So in saying that, the first collection that I want to look at are these images from the American Southwest. Again, a lot of you guys have probably seen these before. So you'll see the look for this series is really this kind of lower contrast, really bright, midtones are lifted pretty high, shadows are opened up. It's kind of this really washed out pastel look. And I'm trying to build that consistency through all of these images. So just paying attention to things like the skies, the blues and the cyans, also the luminance of the sky. So making sure that I'm trying to avoid these kind of deeper, darker blues, and build this consistency of this kind of lighter, washed out look, like I said, through all of them. So in saying that, it gives me this kind of baseline to work off when I'm editing, because when I get work back from the lab, I know exactly kind of how I want it to look to tie into that theme. And I'm even thinking of that when I'm shooting as well. So in this case, this image is going to be really, really simple to edit to get to that point. So a lot of the times it's just shadows and highlights, playing with those. Usually I'm opening my shadows way up. So this one's, let's say, around 80, quite a bit. Probably pull my highlights down a little bit. And then I'm usually always warming my scans up by quite a bit. So I'm going to go around +8 for this one. And depending on this individual scans, sometimes I'm pulling some magenta out because I really want this kind of a little bit of green, a little bit of cyan cast to them. And for this image, this one was actually pretty simple, but that's it. That's probably where I would stay. I might tweak things a little bit here and there, but if we look at the before and we look at the after, let's even pull them up beside each other. So there is a difference when you look at them side by side, for sure. There's a kind of a, I wouldn't say a drastic difference, but very noticeable difference. But the edits that we made were very simple. So opening the shadows way up, pulling the highlights down, and just warming the image up a bit and pulling a little bit of the magenta out. And you can see how that changes how the blue is rendered in the sky. So now it's kind of become a little bit more of a teal, which is what I'm after. You can see that warmth from the color balance has really been accentuated in these, this kind of brush here and even on the pavement down here. And then obviously opening the shadows up has taken a lot of that contrast out, which is what I want. I still want blacks, which you can see up here. We're pretty close to having some blacks, but through a lot of the tonal range, I want a lot of that information kind of pushed far up the histogram. And you'll see this trend as we go, where a lot of my histograms are kind of have this mound of information really in the kind of upper third. So yeah, simple, super, super simple. Shadows opened up, highlights pulled down, and as we go, like I said, we're gonna notice this trend through these images, but pretty straightforward. So next one here, we're gonna skip one, we'll jump to this one. And again, all these images I'm showing are after. So I'm gonna kind of show you the final image, and then we can kind of go through the steps of how I got there and look at how things affected the process. So for this one, if we look at the adjustments I made here, again, we're gonna notice this theme. So a lot of the information is in this upper third. Warmth, pulled out magenta, added a little bit of contrast. That would have been after these initial tonal adjustments here with the shadows and the highlights. And then I added a little bit of saturation here, but that is the finished image, and this is the before. So a lot of the times I find that the scans I get back from the lab are a little bit too contrasty, and then they're a little cool for the look that I'm going for. So a lot of the things I'm doing for this series is bringing some of that warmth back, opening up the shadows, opening up the midtones to kind of pull out some of that contrast, and then I'll play with the highlights a little bit. So you'll see in this one, I pulled down the highlights a bit and I opened up the shadows. And those are the kind of the two most impactful adjustments that I make. And I know it might not seem like much and it might seem super basic, but for me, all that matters is just getting an image to a point where I'm happy with how it looks. That's it. I don't really look too much into kind of what I did. It's just, how do I get it there to a point where it looks good to my eyes? So these are really, really simple adjustments. Again, warmth and pulling out some of that magenta. So if we zero these out, you'll see it's pretty cool to begin with. So pulling some magenta out and then warming it up quite a bit. I think we're around +8. And all of these California images that we're looking at were shot with Portra 400. And what I really love about that film, and the reason that I used it exclusively for this series, is I really like the way that it renders the blues and the oranges and stuff like that. And obviously in the desert, the color palette is a lot of these complementary colors, this blues and these oranges or browns. So I've just seemed to have a lot of success by just warming my images up. And then in terms of the actual colors themselves, I don't have to touch anything because the film really has rendered those colors nice. It's just a matter of nailing that color balance in post. Okay, so let's jump to the next image. Again, I'm gonna notice this consistency and this similarity between all these images. And unfortunately, there's nothing groundbreaking here. So I apologize if you were hoping to find some kind of secret tips and tricks. Everything is very, very simple for these. Let's reset this one and we'll edit this one from the start. So this is how the image was when I got it back from the lab. So I almost always start with the shadows because the images I get back are 9 times out of 10 too contrasty. So for this one, I would have opened the shadows way up. Again, I want those shadows and those midtones lifted up to really kind of tie in with that theme I'm going for. I probably would have gave this a little bit of an exposure bump as well. Not much, not even a quarter of a stop. Pull these highlights down a bit. And then some warmth for sure. Maybe just a little bit of that magenta out. And then, like I said, the greens aren't bad throughout here, but it's this area right here where it's just kind of a little unnatural. So I would have pulled some of that green out, maybe somewhere around -20. And yeah, as easy as that. So I think it just comes down to really having an idea of what you're looking for across a series of images. And that takes experimenting, and that could take some time. It's not something that's going to come right away. But when you do know that, it kind of gives you a clear direction when you're editing your images, which is important. And then also experimenting with film and finding one that you really like, and that also helps a lot. So again, for me, using Portra 400 for these desert images, I'm really not touching colors at all. I'm touching the color balance a little bit just to warm the image up and pull a little bit of magenta out. But other than that, the way that the blues are rendered and the browns and the oranges and the reds and stuff like that, you know, I'm not touching anything in the hue sliders and changing those just because I really like how they come across. So that's saving me time, but then it's also just making things a lot easier and straightforward when I'm editing these images as a whole, not trying to match things. And again, in this image, you'll notice a lot of the information up on the histogram is in the upper third. So following that theme. Once again here, we look at the histogram, same thing. So this consistency between these images. So we're gonna look at 2 more images here before we jump to the next series. I'll just show this one again. This is gonna be, feels like it's getting repetitive now. But I guess it's getting across my point. So again, histogram, everything's way up in this upper third. This is the after, there's the before. So actually this image is a pretty good example because this one was quite contrasty. The before was quite contrasty. And not only does having this idea of what you want, this very clear idea of what you want, help you with, I guess, speed when it comes to editing, but it also helps you see the potential in images. So for example, this one, when I opened up the folder, when I got my film scans back, my initial kind of reaction looking at this image is I wouldn't be that excited. It's very dull, it's pretty contrasty, it's a little dark, it doesn't have this kind of vibrancy and this pop. But right away for me, I know, oh, okay, I know how to get this where I want to get it very easily. And sometimes that can save images because you might, your initial impressions looking at an image, you might kind of disregard it because it might not look great once you get it back from the lab. So once you build this kind of consistency and know what you're looking for, it can help you out in that way as well. So let's reset this one again. Oh, so it looks like I cropped it. It looks like I got some of my finger in there. So let's go and crop this quickly. Okay, actually could probably use a little bit of a rotation as well. So again, probably start by bumping the exposure up a little bit. Shadows way open. And that's why I always start with the shadows adjustment, because you can see how big of a difference it makes. Huge. In this case, for what I'm looking for. So all of a sudden, the image is transformed quite a bit. This one definitely needs a little more warmth, and then this one definitely needs a little bit of that magenta pulled out. And then I don't often touch saturation, but I probably would in this scenario because I just want these blues and this teal to pop a little more, and same with the yellow. It feels just a little kind of bland right now. And I'm just going to do a global adjustment. If I wanted, I could go down here into the HSL sliders and adjust these separately. But for the most part in this series, I'm never really looking for super saturated, vibrant colors. So I would probably just give it, in this case, 7 points of global saturation adjustment. And that's it. Okay, one more, and this one's just a little bit different, and this kind of ties into what I was talking about before with just kind of having confidence in your approach for editing and how that can affect certain images that you might not necessarily think have potential when you first look at them after getting your scans back. So this image, you'll see quite a difference. This was the before, and this is the after. And I really like this image, and when I was shooting it, I was really excited about it as well, because the light was amazing, the atmosphere was amazing. And then when I got the scans back and I saw the initial image, I was a little kind of disappointed because it really didn't feel like it represented the feeling when I was there this morning. This was at the Salton Sea, and there was kind of this low-hanging kind of fog and mist that was lingering a little bit. And then I had the morning light, and everything kind of took on a little bit of this glow. And you can see that the initial image is just really flat and not that exciting. Whereas the edited image, to me, feels a lot more like the experience that I had when I was there. So let's look at how we got there. And as you can guess, it's probably going to be very similar to what we did with the previous images. And that's funny, it actually looks like, look at this massive hair that I obviously missed, and I've posted this image online. That's funny. Okay, so again, first place I would always start. You can see that when we look at the histogram up here, we're not losing any detail. It's just kind of flat overall. So I would start by opening these shadows way up, because how it stands from the lab, it's really dark. So not a lot of separation in the foreground here. So I'd open these shadows way up, and again, for me and the way that I'm trying to get my images to look, that always does a lot. And then I'm also going to pull these highlights down a bit. Even though the information's there, it's getting a little bright in these extreme highlights. I don't want to do it too much because it is sunrise, and obviously this area of the sky would have been very bright, but I do want to just pull it down a bit. Okay, so even that from a tonality standpoint is pretty good. And now this is where color balance is going to play a big role. Sunrise and sunset shots, if you're getting lab scans or if you're scanning at home, they're the ones that really kind of getting the color balance right is super important, because that's going to bring that warmth and that glow to the image. And usually when you scan them, it's the scanning software is trying to make your image look neutral. So a lot of the times the sunrise and sunset images are going to be cooler, not have that kind of warmth and that glow that they usually would. So first place I'm going to start is by warming this image up, and I don't need to warm it up too much. Just even here, we'll go around 6, plus 6. What's really going to make the biggest difference here is the magenta, and you'll see that the image does have some warmth to it now, but it also feels kind of green. In the morning, obviously there's warmth, but there's usually also this kind of reddish orangey glow that accompanies that warmth. So we'll see here, we're going to take a lot of green out and add quite a bit of magenta. So that was plus, let's do plus 18, and then we're going to now add a little bit more warmth as well. And you'll see the difference that made. I'm going to pull these highlights down a bit now. But that made a huge difference in terms of taking this image from feeling like this kind of neutral, drab, almost overcast look to this very warm and rich kind of morning sun feel, which is exactly what I remember. I remember because of this fog or this mist that was kind of lingering, it's almost like everything in the atmosphere or everything in the surroundings kind of picked up this glow from the sun that kind of just came over the horizon. So recreating that is really important. And the biggest adjustment for us was pulling some of that green out. You'll see if we take that back to 0, we get nowhere near the same feel. Now if we're back up around plus 18, it really kind of brings that morning glow feel to the image. So let's just look at as shot. So that's the color balance the way it would have come back from the lab, and this is after we adjusted it. So this image is a really good example that post-processing and editing doesn't need to be super complicated. You don't need to make 75 adjustments and be masking things and tweaking things, obviously depending on what you're going for. But in this scenario, we're getting some pretty drastic differences, especially in this image in terms of the look, but the adjustments that we made were pretty minor. In this one, it was literally just shadows and highlights in the color balance, but the difference between the two images is pretty drastic. Okay, so let's jump into the next set of images. And like I mentioned, these ones are from a new series I'm working on, and the editing done on these is a little more, I guess, heavy-handed than the previous series. And there's a good difference between the two and the look I'm going for. And again, it all comes down to knowing the style and the look that you're trying to build into your image for a specific series. So the first one here, let's jump to the before. So that's the before. And if we look at them side by side, you'll notice there's quite a big difference between the two. And what's really important is that when I was creating this image in the field, I was really kind of paying attention to how it felt and what the final image, how I wanted it to look. And again, that's really important because it gave me direction when I got my scans back to be able to edit them to get them to a point where I was happy with them and where they kind of reflected how things felt when I was there. And if we look at the before here, you'll notice, for me when I first saw this, it's bright, it's too bright. Not necessarily, it doesn't really look that bright, but for the direction that I'm going and the look I'm trying to build, it's way too bright. It's lower in contrast, and there's not a lot of separation, so it's kind of flat to me. And when I was on location, it was this car that kind of really popped out and contrasted against this darker kind of surroundings. So the grass and everything here. So I really wanted to kind of bring that separation back between the car and the grass. And you'll see in the finished image, I got there. So for these images, with the kind of in contrast to the previous series we looked at, my go-to with those was to open up the shadows right away. That was kind of my initial adjustments that started to kind of get the image looking a little bit closer to how I wanted to look and how I envisioned it. So with these, the exposure slider is going to be that first adjustment that I'm tackling because the brightness levels are just too high. It's not giving me that feeling that I had when I was there on location. So we're going to pull this one down quite a bit. And I'm not worried about how the image looks overall right now. I'm just worried about kind of getting the overall brightness to a point that I'm happy with. And somewhere around there is what's working. And now this image is pretty flat. So with this series of images, I'm going quite contrasty with them. So I'm going to bring a lot of contrast in just to bring separation back. This looks really bad, but I'm going to stick with 100 because I'm also going to adjust some of the individual components here. So we got contrast up at 100. The image isn't as flat. It definitely does not look great though. So I'm going to open those shadows way up. It's not doing a ton, but it is taking the edge off a bit. We're also going to bring the whites back up quite a bit. Maybe not that much, but somewhere around there. Same with the blacks. And then same with the highlights. And then I'm going to bring some warmth into this image. Not a ton, so maybe something like that. And then the added contrast has brought some saturation into this image. These greens are just a little bit too vibrant for me. So we're going to pull some of that green out. Just because with this series, especially, I'm not looking for a really kind of saturated and vibrant look, obviously with the subject matter. So maybe somewhere around there. And then I'm also going to just grab the blacks here at the bottom of this curve and lift them just a bit. We did 1.6%, just so they aren't crushed. And then we're gonna kind of do the same with the highlights, pull those down just a hair, just so we don't have these really kind of deep, rich blacks and whites as well. I kind of just want to neutralize those a little bit. So again, I think that's pretty close to where I was. There's the before, there's the after, but you'll see, starting with that exposure, getting the overall brightness of the image back down to a point that I'm happy with, and then kind of bringing some life back into the image, some contrast so it's not as flat, and getting some separation with the tones, and then using the shadows and the whites and the blacks, and then the curve as well, just to kind of adjust that, because obviously, especially in this image, we're going contrast up to 100. It just looked really bad at that point. Everything was a little too crushed, so just taking the edge off of it a little bit with those sliders. Okay, gonna rip through these last two here. So this one again, just like with the Southwest series, we're gonna notice a theme with these images from this new series. So before, after. A lot of the same edits as with the last one. And the biggest thing with this image is that when I got this initial scan back, the brightness was what stood out, just like with the previous one, just because when I was creating this image, what I really liked about it was the light. Just had this kind of back/side light that was hitting the side of this car, and it was just really this kind of cool focal point. And when I got this image back, the initial scan, again, just felt flat, and it didn't kind of pop as much as it did when I was there on location. So again, I'm gonna start just by bringing that exposure down to a point where I feel like, okay, this is starting to look more like how I want it to look. Just isolating this nice kind of side light, backlight here on the car. And then from there, again, it's really flat now, so I'm gonna bring some contrast into the image. Something like that. Want to open these shadows way up, just because especially back here, it was getting really dark. Not that I care too much about seeing the details back there, but I don't want it really crushed. I'm gonna bring these blacks up maybe just a bit. Pull these highlights down a bit to save some of this detail, but then just bring the whites up a little bit. We might actually increase the exposure just a little bit. And then bringing maybe just a little bit of, let's go up to 3 points there, and then pulled a little bit of that magenta out. So something like that is feeling quite a bit better. And actually, you know what, we might pull this exposure down a bit more. Something like that. Maybe I'll pull a little bit of the global saturation out. Lift these highlights up a bit. But now this area is feeling a lot more isolated. You know what, maybe we'll even pull these shadows down a bit, because this was really the focal point for me when I was on location. And obviously the original scan isn't doing it justice how it felt. So again, starting with this exposure slider for these series of images, just to get these to a point where I'm happy with kind of these focal points that I'm looking for in these images. Okay, last image here we'll look at real quick. So this was obviously the after. Let's do a side by side here, and that's the before. Quite a big difference. And again, exposure is pretty huge on this one. So this one I had quite a number of adjustments done. So we're gonna just kind of go through them all. I'm not gonna re-edit this image because I might not be able to get it back on the fly exactly to this point really quickly. So we're gonna look at what I did. But again, the exposure is the biggest one. And if we look at the before, I was excited about this image when I created it. And then when I saw this initial scan, I was like, oh, it doesn't really feel like I thought it was going to feel. And the biggest thing for that is just, it was way too bright. Again, this car was in kind of underneath a bunch of trees. It felt really dark. There are these little hints of light on it. and just these little details that kind of popped out. And in this initial image, none of that is kind of coming through. I'm not feeling any of that. Whereas the edited image is feeling a lot happier with that, and it's more kind of what I was expecting. So a big thing with this one, if we go back up, so this would have been the initial exposure. Obviously other things are adjusted, so you know, let's go ahead and zero a bunch of these out. So this would have been roughly where we are at when I got the scan back. And again, starting with the exposure, so just pulling this way down, something like that. Just bringing back some of that kind of darkness that I felt being covered by those trees where this car was located. And then obviously bringing some contrast in. Bring those shadows way up. Bringing those blacks way up. And same with the whites again. Something like that. So after that, I just did, actually with this one, I did do some saturation adjustments just because I really did enjoy kind of the blues and the teals in the car and then the oranges and the yellows here. So I wanted to just increase the saturation locally of these colors to kind of bring some of that complementary color or that contrast back in. So as we look at these two series, the second series obviously is a little more heavy-handed when it comes to the editing, just to get those images to a point that I'm happy with. But really there's nothing too drastic done on any of these. And the most important part, as we've seen, is that all of the decisions that I'm making are intentional ones based off of just having a really clear idea of how I want these images to look. Especially for the second set of images, it would be really easy to look at those and just get discouraged right away and not be happy with them because they were really flat, they were too bright. But knowing that, okay, I wanted to go for a darker look, I wanted to kind of isolate these areas of these images that were catching my eye when I was there on location. And that led me to making those exposure adjustments and those tonality adjustments. So really, editing comes down to obviously knowing the software and how to use it's important, but what's more important and most important, in my opinion, is just taking the time to really think about how you want your images to look and what's most appealing to you when you're on location. So maybe that's something you make mental notes of, or maybe even you make actual notes when you're in the field. But the more you can do that and the more that you can pay attention and have a clear idea of how you want things to be, the easier your editing is going to be and the happier you're going to be with your images. So anyways, I hope that this kind of quick look at my workflow and the decisions that I make helps you in one way or another. Again, nothing groundbreaking at all, but this is just a way of working that for me is very simple, but it's producing results that I'm really happy with and helping me build these kind of bodies of work that have a consistent look and theme that is in line with what I'm looking for as a photographer when I'm out there creating.